Charity case, that's what my sister called me. In front of my mother, her husband, 12 dinner guests, and a lawyer she didn't know was already watching her face. She said it like a fact. Like something everyone in that room already agreed on but was too polite to say out loud. And maybe they did agree. I didn't argue. I never argued. I just set down my glass of sweet tea, smoothed the front of my cardigan, and waited. I had learned a long time ago that the truth doesn't need your help. It arrives on its own schedule. Sometimes it arrives in an envelope. Before I tell you what happened that Sunday afternoon, I want to know where you're watching this from. Drop your country and your local time in the comments. I'll read every single one. A few weeks earlier, my mother called me on a Tuesday night. She didn't call often, not because we weren't close, but because Dorothy Ross had a rule about phone calls. She said if something was worth saying, it was worth saying in person. So when she called, I picked up before the second ring. Queenie, she said. Just my name. The way she said it told me everything. Not scared, not sad. Just decided, Mom. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, baby. I just need you to come home for my birthday. The whole day. Not just dinner. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage of a federal building I am not allowed to name, still in uniform, eating a granola bar because I had skipped lunch again. My badge was clipped to my chest. My rank was printed on my collar. And I was 44 years old, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and the sound of my mother's voice made something in my chest go loose. I'll be there, I said. Bring nothing. Just yourself, Mom. I mean it, Queenie. No flowers, no cake from that fancy bakery, no envelope. Just you. I almost laughed. She knew me too well. I had been sending money home for 11 years in ways she technically wasn't supposed to know the full details of, and she had never once said thank you out loud because she understood why I didn't want her to. Saying thank you would have made it a transaction. We both preferred it to feel like breathing, like something you just did because the alternative was unthinkable. Just me, I said. Okay, she hung up without saying goodbye. That was also a Dorothy Ross rule. She said goodbyes were for people who weren't sure they'd talk again. I sat in that parking garage for another 4 minutes before I started the car. I thought about the case on my desk. I thought about the deposition scheduled for Thursday. I thought about the fact that I hadn't been home, really home, for a full day in almost 8 months. Then I stopped thinking about all of it and drove. I need to tell you about the house before I tell you about the party. My mother's house is a pale yellow Craftsman on a corner lot in a neighborhood that used to be working class and is now the kind of place where young couples pay too much for original hardwood floors and call it charming. The house has been in our family for 31 years. My father bought it the year I was born. He died when I was 19, and my mother stayed, not because she had no options, but because she said the house still smelled like him in certain rooms on certain mornings, and she wasn't ready to give that up. I understood that more than I ever told her. Denise had been trying to get my mother to sell for 3 years. She had reasons, of course. Denise always had reasons. The maintenance costs, the neighborhood changing, the stairs being hard on Mom's knees. She had sent Mom listings for condominiums twice, both of them in communities with words like active and vibrant in the name, both of them 40 minutes from anyone Mom actually knew. Each time, Mom had folded the listings neatly and placed them in the recycling bin without comment. Denise took this as confusion. I took it as clarity. My sister is not a cruel woman in the way that word usually sounds. She doesn't enjoy hurting people. She is something more complicated than cruel. She is a woman who has convinced herself, over many years and with great thoroughness, that what she wants is the same thing as what is right. She married well. She lives in a house with a 3-car garage and a kitchen that got written up in a local magazine. She volunteers. She sends Christmas cards with professional photos. And she has never, not once in the 44 years I have been alive, been able to look at me without calculating something. I used to think it was jealousy. I don't think that anymore. I think it's fear. I think Denise is afraid of what it would mean if I turned out to be something she didn't account for. I arrived at Mom's house at 10:15 on a Sunday morning in April. The street was quiet. Someone 2 houses down was mowing a lawn. A dog was barking at nothing in particular. The wisteria my father planted along the porch railing was blooming, thick purple clusters that my mother cut back every year, and that came back every year anyway, stubborn and indifferent to being managed. I sat in my car for a moment. I was wearing jeans and a pale green blouse and a cardigan I'd had for 6 years. My hair was pinned back the way I always wore it off duty, neat, unremarkable, the kind of appearance that invites no questions. I had learned early that the easiest way to move through a room unexamined was to look like someone who didn't need to be examined. People see what they expect to see. I had spent a long time being careful about what I gave them to expect. Mom opened the front door before I reached the porch steps. She was wearing her good blue dress, the one she saved for occasions she considered significant. Her silver hair was set. She was smiling, but it was a specific kind of smile, the kind that sits just below something heavier, the kind that means I know something you don't know yet, and I've decided today is the day you find out. I had seen that smile exactly once before in my life, the morning she told me my father had rewritten his will to leave me his grandfather's watch, and Denise didn't know. I stopped on the second porch step. Mom, what did you do? She tilted her head. I made sweet tea, and I'm 74 years old. Come inside. I went inside. The living room was already set up for the afternoon party. Folding tables along one wall, her good tablecloth, the blue china that only came out for birthdays and funerals. Everything looked normal. Everything smelled like her. Like the gardenia candles she ordered from a shop in Savannah, and the faint cedar of the linen closet, and something underneath all of it that I could only describe as home, the specific gravity of a place that had your whole childhood pressed into its walls. I helped her arrange chairs. We didn't talk about anything important. We talked about the wisteria. We talked about the neighbor's dog. We talked about a book she was reading about a woman who walks across Iceland alone, which my mother found both admirable and unnecessarily dramatic. Guests were arriving at 2. Denise arrived at 1:45. Denise didn't knock. She never knocked at my mother's house. She walked in the way people walk into spaces they've decided belong to them by proximity and effort. The door opened. Her voice came first, and then the rest of her followed. She was wearing a cream-colored wrap dress, and her hair was blown out, and she smelled like the kind of perfume that costs enough to make a point. Her husband, Craig, came in behind her carrying a bakery box and wearing the expression he always wore around my mother's house. Pleasantly attentive, the way a man looks when he is performing the role of good son-in-law rather than actually inhabiting it. Craig Hartwell was a civil attorney. He had a firm downtown with 4 partners and a client list that overlapped in ways I had been professionally aware of for some time, with certain government contracting interests. I was not at liberty to discuss at a birthday party. I was standing near the kitchen doorway when they walked in. Denise saw me, and her smile did the thing it always did. It arrived a half-second late, like a reflex that had to travel a longer distance than it should have. Queenie, she crossed the room and hugged me. The hug was real enough in its way. We were not enemies in any simple sense. We were sisters who had arrived at a particular arrangement over many years. She managed appearances. I disappeared. And we both pretended this was a natural division of labor rather than a negotiated ceasefire. You look tired, she said, pulling back to look at me. I'm fine, I said. You're always fine, she said it lightly. But the word always carried a small weight, the kind of weight that comes from years of repetition. You're always fine meant you never need anything, which in Denise's vocabulary meant you contribute nothing to the ecosystem of family concern, which meant you are, functionally, beside the point. Craig shook my hand. His grip was the kind that wants to establish something. Good to see you, Queenie. Still with the government? Still with the government, I said. He nodded like this confirmed a private theory. Craig had always found my vagueness suspicious. Most people with something to hide recognize vagueness in others and mistake their own discomfort for insight. Guests arrived through the afternoon. 12 in total, not counting family. There was Aunt Patrice, my mother's sister, who had driven 4 hours from Raleigh and immediately claimed the armchair nearest the window. There were 2 of my mother's friends from church, Mrs. Elaine Boateng and her husband Theodore, who brought a covered dish and stayed near the food table with the ease of people who know exactly where they belong in a room. There were Denise's friends, a couple named Warren and Sylvia, who I had met 3 times before, and who always seemed faintly surprised I existed. There was my mother's neighbor from across the street, a retired school teacher named Pearl, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and said whatever she thought without apparent concern for its reception, and there was Commander Gerald Hartman. I didn't know him when he walked in. He was a tall man, mid-70s, with white hair cut short, and a posture that told you more about his history than any introduction could. He moved slowly but precisely, the kind of man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that deliberate movement communicated more authority than speed. He was wearing a blazer over a plaid shirt, and there was a small Navy veteran pin on his lapel that caught the afternoon light when he leaned down to kiss my mother's cheek. My mother took his hand in both of hers. "Gerald," she said. "You came, Dorothy?" He smiled. Wouldn't have missed it. She turned to me with that same smile from the morning, that particular smile. "Queenie, this is Gerald Hartman. He served with your father." "Gerald, this is my younger daughter, Queenie. He looked at me the way some people from that generation look at you, when they're not just seeing your face but cross-referencing it against something. A memory, a file, a name they heard in a different context. It lasted only a second, then he extended his hand. "Your father was a good man," he said. "One of the best I knew. He talked about you," I said. "He called you Bucky." Something shifted in his eyes, not surprise, exactly. More like recognition of a particular kind, the kind that goes both directions at once. "He called everyone something," he said. That was his gift. We shook hands and he moved on toward the food table, and I watched him go, and I thought, he knows something. I didn't know yet what it was. I didn't know yet that he had read a case summary 8 months ago in a JAG document forwarded to a veteran's legal advisory board, and that the name and call sign on the cover page had stopped him cold. I didn't know any of that yet. The early part of the party was the kind of pleasant that requires a certain amount of effort to maintain. My mother moved through the room with the ease of a woman who has spent decades making other people comfortable in her presence. She laughed at the right moments. She remembered details. Elaine's granddaughter's name, Warren's recent knee surgery, Pearl's ongoing campaign to get the city to repave the sidewalk on their block. She held the room together the way she always had, with the specific warmth of someone who understood that attention, real attention, is the rarest gift you can give another person. I stayed near the edges. That was my habit. I refilled glasses. I carried dishes to the kitchen. I spoke when spoken to and listened more than I talked, which most people experience as politeness, and which is, in my case, also professional training. Denise watched me do this from across the room. I could feel it. Not hostilities exactly. Something more specific. Accounting. She was calculating something again, and I could see from the particular set of her jaw that she was arriving at a number she didn't like. The cake came out at 4 o'clock. My mother blew out all 74 candles in 2 tries, which Pearl declared a miracle, and Aunt Patrice declared genetic, and everyone laughed. And for about 4 minutes the room was genuinely, uncalculatingly happy. Then Denise tapped her fork against her glass. The sound of a fork against crystal has a way of reorganizing a room. Conversations stop, faces turn. The ambient noise of a party collapses into a single point of attention, and whoever is holding the glass suddenly holds something else. The moment, the narrative, the direction of what comes next. Denise knew this. She had always known how to use a room. She was standing near the head of the table, one hand holding her champagne flute, the other smoothing the front of her dress in a gesture that looked like composure but was actually preparation. "I just want to say a few words about Mom," she began. "She was good at this. I'll give her that." Her voice was warm and her pacing was confident, and she had the particular gift of people who have spent years performing competence. She made you feel like you were witnessing something genuine, even when you understood, on some level, that you were watching a production. She talked about our mother's strength. She talked about the sacrifices Dorothy Ross had made raising 2 daughters after losing a husband too young. She talked about the house, the traditions, the way Mom had held the family together through everything. And I listened, and I thought, this is true. All of it is true. That was the thing about Denise that made her so difficult to simply be angry at. She wasn't lying. She was just editing. She was telling the true parts and leaving out the other parts, and the result was a version of the story that positioned her at the center of it. "Mom," Denise said, and her voice softened in a way that I knew meant she was approaching the point. "You have never asked for help without deserving it. You have never taken more than you needed. And the people in this room who love you have been so grateful to be able to show up for you." Applause. Soft, warm, genuine. Denise glanced at me then. Just for a moment. And in that glance was the entire history of our particular arrangement. The acknowledgement that she had shown up, and I had not. That she had been present, and I had been absent. That her name was on the emergency contact forms, and mine was not. All of that in one glance. I held it without expression. She raised her glass. "To Dorothy Ross, the woman who holds us all together." Everyone raised their glasses. I raised mine. The toast was over. The room loosened again. People moved toward the cake, toward the food table, toward each other. And then Denise came to find me. I was standing near the window at the far end of the living room, the one that looked out onto the side yard where my father had planted a vegetable garden 30 years ago, and where my mother now grew tomatoes and one stubborn rosemary bush that survived every winter through what appeared to be sheer personal conviction. I was watching the rosemary and drinking sweet tea, and not thinking about very much. Denise stopped beside me. She didn't look at me directly. She looked out the window too, and for a moment we just stood there, sisters looking at the same yard, and it was almost comfortable. "She's happy today," Denise said. "She is," I said. A pause. "The kind of pause that is not empty. You know she worries about you," Denise said. "She doesn't say it, but she does. When you disappear for months at a time and nobody can reach you, she can always reach me," I said. "She has my number, Queenie." Denise's voice dropped, not threatening, something more like exhausted. "I'm not trying to start anything. I'm just saying, she's 74. She's not going to be here forever, and when something happens, I need to know that you're actually going to be present for it. Not just here for a Sunday and gone again." I looked at her then. "I'm aware of how old our mother is, are you? Because from where I stand it looks like." She stopped, reconsidered, looked back out the window. "You know what? It doesn't matter. I'm not doing this today." She started to move away, and then Craig said something from across the room, something to Warren about a project downtown. And Denise paused, and something in her expression realigned, and she turned back to me with a smile that was a different shape than the earlier ones. "I just think," she said quietly, "that it would mean a lot to Mom if you contributed more. That's all. Even just showing up more consistently. Instead of relying on everyone else to keep things running." I looked at her. "She's managing," Denise continued, the smile steady now, "but the house costs money. Her medications cost money. All of that is being handled, but it would be nice if you could. Even something small. I know the government doesn't exactly." She gestured vaguely at my cardigan, my jeans, the overall composition of me that she had decided, long ago, constituted evidence of limitation. "I know things aren't. I know you do what you can," she said it gently. That was the thing. She said it with her head tilted and her voice soft and her expression careful. The way you speak to someone fragile, someone you are trying not to embarrass further, She said it in front of Pearl, in front of Mrs. Boateng, in front of Commander Hartman, who was standing 6 feet away and had gone very still. She said, "You've always been the one who needed a little more looking after, Queenie. There's no shame in that. Some people give and some people, well, we've always taken care of you. That's what family does." She paused for effect, perhaps, or perhaps because she believed what she was saying completely. "You're not a burden, exactly. I don't mean it like that. It's okay to be the charity case. Mom doesn't mind. None of us do." The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. I stood very still. I was 44 years old, and I had sat in military courtrooms where generals lied under oath, and I had not flinched. I had been accused of things I did not do, and I had held my posture through 8 months of suspension and investigation, and I had not broken. I had learned, in places I cannot describe at a birthday party, how to absorb impact without showing the wound, so I stood still. I set my sweet tea down on the windowsill very carefully, and I said nothing. Commander Hartman set his plate down. The room was still in the way that only happens when people are pretending it isn't. Conversations had resumed, barely carefully, the way you resume breathing after something knocks the air out of you. Pearl was looking at her cake. Mrs. Boateng was looking at the tablecloth. Warren and Sylvia had found something fascinating to discuss near the far wall. Craig was watching Denise with the particular attentiveness of a man who has learned to monitor his wife's performances for signs of overreach. And my mother was watching all of it from her chair at the head of the table, with her hands folded in her lap and that smile, that same specific smile, very quiet on her face. I had not moved from the window. Commander Hartman had not moved either. He was standing with his plate set aside, his arms loose at his sides, and he was looking at me with an expression I recognized. Not pity, not sympathy, something more considered than either of those. The expression of a man who has been in rooms where something important was about to happen and has learned to be very still in the seconds before it does. Then my mother said, "Dale," and the room turned. Mr. Dale Whitfield had been sitting quietly near the hallway for the better part of an hour. A slender man in his early 60s with silver-framed glasses and the careful posture of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment. I had noticed him when I arrived, but had not been introduced. I had assumed he was one of my mother's church acquaintances. He was not. He stood when my mother said his name. He reached into the leather portfolio on the chair beside him and withdrew 2 envelopes. Both were sealed. Both were ivory, the kind of paper that means something has been prepared with intention. He crossed the room toward my mother. My mother said, "The one for Queenie first, please, Dale." Mr. Whitfield looked at the envelopes. He looked at me. He looked at Denise, who was standing 4 feet to my left and had not yet registered what was happening. And then, whether from a misread of the room, a moment of distraction, or something my mother had quietly arranged and never told me about, he turned toward Denise and held out the envelope. "Ms. Ross Hartwell," he said. Denise took it without thinking. People take things that are handed to them. It is reflex. It requires no decision. She had the envelope in her hands before the situation had fully assembled itself in her mind. My mother said nothing. Her hands were still folded. Her smile had not changed. Denise looked at the envelope. She looked at my mother. She looked at Mr. Whitfield, who had taken a small, precise step backward. "What is this?" she said. "Go ahead and open it," my mother said. Her voice was calm. It was the voice she used when she had already decided how something would go and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to arrive at the same conclusion. Denise opened the envelope. I watched her face. I watched it the way I have learned to watch faces in courtrooms and deposition rooms and interrogation-adjacent spaces. Not for the large expressions, which are always performed, but for the small ones, the involuntary ones, the half-second shifts that happen before the person knows they are happening. She unfolded the document. She read the first line. Her face did nothing. She read the 2 line. A small contraction appeared between her eyebrows. She read further. The contraction deepened, her lips parted slightly. She looked up at my mother, then at me, then back at the document. She stopped. Started again. This is a trust account. Yes, Mr. Whitfield said. In Queenie's name, Lieutenant Commander Queenie Ross. Yes. As the establishing trustee, the room, which had been pretending to have other conversations, stopped pretending. Denise's voice was very careful now. The balance on this account is. She looked at the number again, as if looking a second time might change it. This says $412,000, Mr. Whitfield said. Accrued over 11 years. The account was structured as a household support trust, with your mother as the named beneficiary and primary account holder for daily expenses. Lieutenant Commander Ross has been the funding source throughout. The silence in the room was a different kind of silence now. Not the uncomfortable silence of before, something heavier. Something that required people to rearrange information they had been holding for a long time. Denise was looking at me. Her expression had gone somewhere I had not seen it go before, past the accounting, past the performance, into something unguarded and unready. Craig had stopped his conversation with Warren entirely. He was very still in the food table, a specific kind of still. Commander Hartman picked up the document sleeve that had fallen from the envelope when Denise opened it. It had landed on the side table beside him. He reached for it without thinking, the way you reach for something that has fallen near you, meaning only to set it aside. He looked at it for 1 second. Then he looked at me. The sleeve was a cover sheet, the kind that accompanies legal documents prepared by JAG-affiliated counsel. At the top, in the standard format I had signed off on 11 years ago and updated every 3 years since, was my full professional designation, Queenie A. Ross, USN, JAG Corps, Naval Legal Service Office, callsign, Soverigen. Gerald Hartman had been retired for 7 years. But he had spent 31 years inside a system where names and call signs moved through documents and briefings and after-action reports, and some of them lodged permanently, the way certain things do. Not because you tried to remember them, but because they were attached to something significant enough that forgetting was never really an option. He had read the name Essever in a case summary 8 months ago, a summary forwarded to the Veterans Advisory Board on which he served, a summary that described, in the careful language of official documentation, a JAG officer who had single-handedly reconstructed a chain of evidence that exonerated 3 wrongly court-martialed enlisted personnel and resulted in the prosecution of 2 senior officers for misconduct and obstruction. He had thought then, whoever this is, I'd want them on my side. He had not connected the name to the woman standing quiet at the birthday party of an old friend's widow. He connected it now. He set the sleeve down on the table. He straightened. He looked at Denise with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who has outlasted many rooms. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that a room leans into rather than away from. "Your sister didn't need looking after." He paused. She was the one doing the looking after. For 11 years. While the rest of you were looking at her cardigan, Denise's mouth opened. Nothing came out. My mother unfolded her hands in her lap, and I stood at the window and looked at the rosemary bush in the side yard, and I breathed, and I did not say a word, because I had learned a long time ago that when the truth finally arrives, the kindest thing you can do is get out of its way. Gerald Hartman asked me to sit with him on the back porch. Not immediately. First, there was the necessary disorder of the room reassembling itself. The murmur of voices finding their footing again. The careful choreography of people who needed something to do with their hands and found it in refilling plates and carrying glasses to the kitchen and asking my mother if she needed anything, which was their way of excusing themselves from a moment too large to stand inside comfortably. Denise had gone quiet in the particular way of someone who has not yet decided which version of herself to deploy next. Craig had taken out his phone. I noted this and said nothing. My mother was talking to Pearl and Mrs. Boateng, and her voice was warm and unhurried, and she did not look at me, but I felt her awareness of me the way you feel weather. Not as a thought, as a physical thing. Commander Hartman touched my elbow lightly as he passed. "Back porch," he said. "When you're ready." I waited 5 minutes. Then I went. The back porch ran the length of the house and faced east, away from the street, toward a yard that backed up against a wooden fence my father had built, and my mother had never replaced because she said it was still good. There were 2 wooden chairs out there, old ones, the kind with flat arms wide enough to set a glass on. The late afternoon light was long and soft, and the yard smelled like cut grass and something flowering I couldn't identify. Commander Hartman was already seated. He had a glass of sweet tea, and his jacket was unbuttoned. And he looked like a man who had been sitting on porches like this one for most of his life and knew how to do it correctly. I sat in the other chair. For a moment, neither of us said anything. A bird was working through something complicated in the oak tree at the back of the yard. The sounds of the party came through the screen, door muffled and distant. "Sauvery IGN," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir," he nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are confirming something they had already decided was true. I read the Maher case summary. 8 months ago, the advisory board gets copies of certain JAG proceedings, precedent-setting decisions, cases that affect veteran representation. He paused. "What you did in that case, reconstructing the evidence chain after the original files were flagged as compromised, that was not a small thing. It was the job," I said. He looked at me sideways, the way older men look at you when you have said something they find both understandable and insufficient. "The job," he repeated. "Your father used to say things like that." I looked at my hands. "He was proud of you," Hartman said. "Before he died. He knew you were going to the academy. He told me. He said, 'Gerald, that girl is going to walk into rooms that try to make her small, and she is going to make them bigger instead.'" He paused. I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. I do now. I did not trust myself to speak for a moment. The bird in the oak tree finished whatever it was working on and went quiet. He asked me how I ended up in JAG. I told him the honest version, not the official version, which is clean and linear and omits everything that actually mattered, but the real one, which starts with a specific afternoon in my 2nd year at the academy when I watched a proceeding that was wrong in a way I could not articulate yet but could feel with complete certainty, the way you feel a misalignment in something structural, not a crack, not a collapse, just a thing that is not level and will eventually matter. I had wanted to fly originally. My father had flown. I had grown up with the language of aviation in my house, the way other children grow up with the language of business or medicine or farming. Not as a foreign thing, but as the natural register of people who understood the world through instruments and altitude and the specific discipline of being responsible for other lives at 300 knots. But I sat in that proceeding and I watched a young enlisted man, 22 years old, scared, badly represented, get handed an outcome that had been decided before the arguments began, and something in me rearranged permanently. I decided I wanted to be in the room where the words actually meant something, I told Hartman, where the outcome could still be changed. He was quiet for a moment. "And has it? Been changeable?" "Sometimes," I said. "Not always. But sometimes is enough to keep going." He nodded. He understood that. I could tell. He asked, carefully, about the suspension. I had not spoken about it to anyone outside of official channels in 6 years. I had not spoken about it to my mother, not fully. I had given her the outline. There was an accusation. It was investigated. I was cleared. She had accepted this with the particular trust of someone who does not need the details because they have already decided who you are. I told Hartman more than the outline. I told him about the case I had been building. A procurement fraud matter, military contracting, money moving through layers of civilian intermediary firms in ways that were designed to be difficult to trace but were not, ultimately impossible. I told him about the morning I arrived at work and found that a key witness had recanted and that an internal report had been filed alleging that I had made unauthorized contact with the witness, contact that could constitute witness tampering. I told him the allegation was false. I told him the 8 months felt like being buried alive in paperwork. The investigation, the administrative hold, the reviews. I had sat in rooms where people I had worked beside for years looked at me with the careful neutrality of people protecting themselves. And I had understood, because I was a lawyer and I knew what careful neutrality meant, that I was considered expendable in a way that had been decided before I walked into any of those rooms. "Who filed the report?" Hartman asked. I looked at the yard. "That took me 4 years to trace, fully," I said. The name on the report was a mid-level administrator I had never met, but the information in it, the specific framing of the allegation, the timing, that required someone with access to my case files and a reason to want the procurement investigation stopped. I paused. The bird in the oak tree had come back and was working on a new problem. Someone with connections to the civilian contractors under investigation, I said. Someone whose professional network overlapped with those firms in ways that would have become relevant if the case had gone to trial. I did not say Craig Hartwell's name, not yet. Not on my mother's back porch on her 74th birthday, with the wisteria coming in through the screen and the sweet tea going warm in my hand. But I watched Hartman's face as I spoke, and I saw the moment he connected what I was not saying to what he had seen inside, at the food table. When the envelope was opened, the specific stillness of a man who had been caught not in a lie but in a proximity to one, Hartman set his glass down very carefully on the wide arm of the chair. "Your father," he said slowly, "would have handled this differently than you." "I know," I said. "He would have said something by now. He would have," I agreed. "But he also would have been wrong." Hartman looked at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time since we had sat down, he smiled. A real one, unguarded, the kind that takes years off a person's face. "Saver Jen," he said again, quietly, like he was testing the weight of it. "It wasn't a name I chose," I said. "They never are," he said. "The real ones never are. I need to go back 6 years. Not because I enjoy it. I have made a particular peace with that period of my life, the kind of peace that is not the absence of damage, but the decision to stop letting the damage make decisions for you. But you cannot understand what happened in the days after my mother's birthday without understanding what happened before it, and the before is long and tangled and has Craig Hartwell's name woven through it in ways I did not fully see until I was ready to look. 6 years ago, I was a lieutenant commander with 8 years in JAG and a caseload that included, among other things, a procurement fraud investigation I will call Case Meridian, because that is not its name and I am still bound by certain obligations even now. Case Meridian involved a series of defense contracts, equipment supply, maintenance, logistics support that had been awarded to a rotating cluster of civilian firms over a period of 4 years. On paper, the contracts were clean. The bids were competitive. The approvals followed procedure. But when you looked at the firms themselves, their registration histories, their ownership structures, the patterns of who won what and when, a shape emerged. Not immediately. Shapes like that are designed not to emerge immediately. They are designed to look like coincidence until the moment you have enough data points to see that coincidence is statistically impossible. I had enough data points by the spring of that year. What I had found, specifically, was a network of shell entities, some registered in Delaware, some in Virginia, one in a jurisdiction that required a subpoena to even access this registration documents, that were funneling contract overcharges through a set of accounts that ultimately led back to 3 individuals with direct ties to a senior procurement official. I will call the colonel because that is what he was. The colonel was decorated, respected, the kind of man whose name appeared on buildings and whose handshake appeared in photographs with people you would recognize. He was also, based on 4 months of evidence reconstruction, running a fraud operation that had cost the government somewhere between $11 and $18 million over a 4-year period. I was 2 weeks from filing formal charges when the allegation against me appeared. The report stated that I had made unauthorized contact with a protected witness, a civilian accountant named Thomas Veal, who had agreed to cooperate with the investigation and whose testimony was central to establishing the money trail. The report stated that I had met with Veal privately outside of official channels and had offered him considerations in exchange for shaping his testimony in a specific direction. It was a precise allegation. Precisely wrong, but precise. It used the right terminology. It referenced specific dates. It described a meeting at a location I had actually been on one of those dates, not to meet Veal, but to visit a client at a medical facility 2 floors above, where Veal was receiving treatment for a condition I had not known about. The precision was the point. Vague allegations are easy to dismiss. Precise allegations require investigation. An investigation requires time, and time was what the people who filed the report needed. Veal recanted his cooperation the same week the report was filed. He said he had been approached, not by me but by someone, and offered something he found more compelling than immunity. He would not say what. He would not say by whom. He was, within 6 months, living in a different state under circumstances that suggested he had received assistance in relocating. The procurement investigation stalled. Then it was reassigned. Then it was quietly closed on the grounds of insufficient evidence. The insufficient evidence being, in large part, the evidence I had spent 4 months reconstructing, and which had been placed under administrative hold during my suspension. The colonel retired with full honors the following year. I was reinstated after 8 months, cleared completely. The investigative report noted no evidence of misconduct and attributed the original allegation to an unverified source that could not be located for follow-up. This is the kind of language that means someone filed a false report and then made themselves unavailable to answer for it. I had known for 4 years, with professional certainty, the approximate shape of who was responsible. What I had not had, until 8 months ago, was the specific thread. It came from an unexpected direction, a civil litigation matter in another jurisdiction that I was not party to, but that was flagged to me by a colleague because it involved a contracting firm whose name appeared in my original Case Meridian files. The litigation had produced, through discovery, a set of internal communications from a law firm that had served as outside counsel to one of the shell entities. The communications were from 6 years ago. They discussed, in the careful language of lawyers who believed they were protected by privilege, the need to address a JAG investigation that had progressed further than anticipated. The outside counsel firm was Hartwell and Associates. Craig's firm. The communications did not mention my name. They did not mention the false allegation. What they mentioned was the investigation, the timeline, the names of the key witnesses, and a reference to a contact at the administrative level who could be useful in managing the situation. Managing, that was the word they used. Not stopping, not interfering, managing. I had brought this to my supervising officer 8 months ago. It was now under active review by a separate JAG division. I was recused from anything directly connected to it. I was not permitted to discuss it with parties who might be connected to the matter. Craig Hartwell was a party connected to the matter. This was why, when I watched Craig go still at the food table as the envelope was opened, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not satisfaction, which would have been too simple, but a kind of solemn recognition, the way you feel when a shape you have been tracing in the dark for years finally resolves into something you can see clearly. He did not know what I knew. He did not know the review was active. He did not know that the same week I was sitting on my mother's back porch drinking sweet tea, a JAG attorney I trusted was sitting in a different office, reviewing communications that had his firm's letterhead on them. He knew only that the envelope had been opened, that the trust account existed, that Hartman had said what he said, that the room had shifted in a direction he had not anticipated. I had watched him process all of this in the space of 3 minutes at a birthday party, and I had watched him arrive, visibly, at the conclusion that he did not yet know how much I knew. That uncertainty, I understood, would do more work in the coming days than anything I could say on a Sunday afternoon. So I had said nothing. I had let him sit with the shape of what might be coming without knowing its dimensions. That was not cruelty. That was not strategy, exactly. That was what it looks like when someone who has spent 6 years being very careful finally decides to stop being careful alone. Craig found me in the kitchen. It was 40 minutes after the envelope. The party had not ended. My mother had not permitted it to end, which I thought was either very wise or very deliberate, and was probably both. She had redirected the room with the practiced ease of a woman who had been managing difficult situations in small spaces for 50 years, producing more cake, more sweet tea, asking Pearl about the sidewalk petition, asking Theodore Boateng about his son's new job, pulling the room back into the orbit of herself until the earlier disruption became, if not forgotten, at least backgrounded. Denise had retreated to the far end of the living room with her champagne and her composure, which she was reassembling visibly and with effort. Craig had waited. I give him that much. He waited until the room was settled, until the moment was private, until there was a reasonable explanation for why he happened to be in the kitchen. At the same time, I was washing a stack of dessert plates that did not need to be washed immediately, but that gave me something to do with my hands. He came in and stood near the counter and said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure," I said. I did not turn around. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him deciding which version of this conversation to have. "That account," he said finally. "The trust. I didn't know about that." "I know," I said. "Denise didn't either. I know that too." Another pause. The water ran over the plate in my hands. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was going blue in the late afternoon light. "She's upset," he said. "Not about the money. About not knowing. About feeling like there's been a whole side of things she wasn't included in." I turned off the water. I set the plate in the drying rack. I turned around and looked at him. Craig Hartwell was a handsome man, in the way that men who have been told they are handsome for 40 years become handsome. It had settled into his face as something assumed rather than earned. He was standing with his arms crossed loosely, his weight back, the posture of a man who was accustomed to being in rooms where he had the advantage and was recalibrating for a room where he was not certain he did. "Craig," I said, "what did you come in here to say?" His jaw moved slightly. "I came to say that I think today got out of hand, and I'd like to find a way to manage it," I said. The word landed. I watched it land. I watched his face do something very small and very fast. A contraction, a reassessment, a recognition that the word had been chosen specifically. "To resolve it," he said carefully. For the family, I repeated. I picked up a dish towel and dried my hands. I was not angry. That was the thing I want you to understand. I was not angry in any way that felt like heat. What I felt was something colder and more precise than anger. The feeling of standing at a window in full daylight, looking at a view you have been looking at for years, and suddenly seeing everything in it correctly. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to think about whether you want to answer it here, like this, or in a different setting with different people present." He said nothing. 6 years ago, I said, there was an investigation. A procurement matter. I was the lead attorney. I kept my voice level and conversational, the way I would keep it in a deposition. The deposition was paused when an allegation was filed against me. The allegation was later found to be unsubstantiated. The case was closed. I folded the dish towel. "Do you know anything about that process?" Craig's arms, which had been crossed loosely, tightened slightly. "That's a strange question to ask at your mother's birthday party," he said. "It is," I agreed. "But you came in here to talk to me, and I'd rather be direct. I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm asking a question. You're a lawyer. You understand the difference. He looked at me for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes. Calculation, risk assessment, the rapid triage of a man trying to determine how much I knew and whether it was more or less than the amount that would be dangerous to him. I think, he said, that whatever you think you know, you should be careful about the conclusions you're drawing. I appreciate that, I said. I'm generally careful, Queenie. He lowered his voice. I'm trying to have a reasonable conversation, so am I. Then can we agree that today was, that things came out in an unexpected way, and that maybe the best thing for everyone is to let the dust settle before? Craig, I set the dish towel down on the counter. There is a review currently active. I am recused from it because of my prior involvement. I cannot discuss its specifics with you. I am telling you this not as a threat and not as a negotiation. I paused. I am telling you because you are married to my sister, and whatever happens next, she is going to need to understand that some of what is coming has nothing to do with me and nothing to do with today, and everything to do with decisions that were made 6 years ago by people who believed they were protected. The kitchen was very quiet. Craig's face had gone through several expressions in the space of 3 seconds and had arrived at something I had not seen on it before. Not the performed competence, not the pleasant son-in-law, not the man calculating angles. Something underneath all of that. Something that looked briefly and honestly like a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and had just felt the weight of it shift. He said nothing. I said nothing. Then the kitchen door opened, and my mother came in carrying 2 empty cake plates and said, "Craig, Denise is looking for you," in the tone of a woman who has spent 49 years raising children and understood exactly what she was walking into and had timed her entrance accordingly. Craig straightened. He looked at my mother. He looked at me. "Thank you for coming today," I said. "It meant a lot to Mom." He left. My mother set the cake plates on the counter and stood beside me and looked out the window at the yard going dark and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said quietly, "Your father would have done it louder." "I know," I said. She patted my hand once, just once, the way she had patted my hand every time I had ever needed it. The same gesture at 7 and at 17 and at 44. And then she picked up the cake plates and put them in the sink. "Good girl," she said. It was the same thing she had said the day I left for the academy. The same thing she had said the day I called her from a federal building parking garage and told her I would be at her birthday. Some things, I thought, do not need to be said more than once to last a lifetime. The guests left in the slow, gentle way that good parties end. Not all at once, not abruptly, but in a gradual loosening, people finding their coats and their leftover cake containers, standing in the doorway a few minutes longer than necessary because the house had been warm and the evening outside was cool, and leaving required a small act of will. Pearl left last of the non-family guests, which surprised no one. She stood in the doorway for a full 7 minutes telling my mother about a documentary she had watched about migratory birds and then, apparently satisfied, kissed my mother on the cheek and walked across the street with her reading glasses swinging on their beaded chain. Commander Hartman had stayed. He was sitting in the living room with his jacket back on, his tea long finished, talking quietly with Aunt Patrice about something that made her laugh. A real laugh, the unself-conscious kind. When Pearl left, he stood, and there was a small, natural pause in the room, and he looked at me across it. "Walk me out," he said. The evening had cooled to something comfortable. The street was quiet. A few houses down someone had turned on a porch light, and it made a warm yellow pool on the sidewalk. The wisteria on the porch railing had closed for the evening, its purple clusters gone to dark shapes against the pale paint of the house. We stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm going to make some calls tomorrow," Hartman said. "I sit on 2 veteran legal advisory boards and I know people in the JAG Administrative Command. Not to interfere. I understand there's an active review. But there are people who should know the name Soveri Igene belongs to someone they want to know about." He paused. "If that's all right with you, You don't need my permission, I said. No, he said. But I'm asking. I thought about it. Not long. I had been thinking about a version of this question for years. In the way you think about questions you have decided the answer to, but keep returning to, because the deciding costs something, and you want to be sure you don't spend it carelessly. Yes, I said. That's all right with me. He nodded. He looked at the house for a moment, at the lit windows, the wisteria, the vegetable garden along the side where my mother's single rosemary bush stood dark and stubborn against the fence. Your father planted that, didn't he? He said. It wasn't quite a question, the rosemary. Yes, seems about right. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. He was like that. Planted things in difficult ground and then acted surprised when they grew. I looked at the rosemary. He wasn't surprised, I said. He just liked watching other people's faces when they saw it. Hartman laughed. A short, genuine sound, the kind that comes without preparation. That is exactly right, he said. That is exactly who he was. He shook my hand at the foot of the steps. His grip was the same as when we'd met. Deliberate, unhurried, the grip of a man who understood that how you take someone's hand tells them something about how you see them, Sauver. IGN, he said one more time. Quietly, the way you say something when you are committing it to a different kind of memory than the one you use for ordinary information. Good night, Commander, I said. He walked to his car. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps and watched until the taillights turned the corner and disappeared. Inside, Denise was in the kitchen. She was alone. Craig had taken the car earlier. Some reason involving an early morning, a client call, something that required his departure before the evening fully resolved. I had watched him go from the kitchen doorway and thought, he needs to make calls too. His calls will be more urgent and less comfortable than Hartman's. Denise was washing the remaining dishes. She had taken off her wrap dress jacket and rolled up her sleeves, and she was working through the stack with the focused efficiency of someone who needed something to do with her body while her mind worked on something else. I came into the kitchen and picked up the dish towel from the counter and stood beside her at the sink. She did not tell me to leave. She did not say anything for a while. The water ran. The dishes moved from sink to rack. The kitchen was warm and smelled like cake and dish soap and the residue of a long day. I didn't know, she said finally. Not loudly. Just the statement, set down between us like something she was tired of carrying. I know you didn't, I said. The money. The account. All of it. I thought. She stopped. She set a glass in the rack and looked at it. I thought you had nothing. I thought the government job was some low-level administrative thing. I thought Mom never asked you for anything because she didn't want to embarrass you. I dried the glass. I know what you thought, and instead you were. She gestured vaguely, the gesture of someone whose vocabulary has temporarily run out. All of that, I was doing the job, I said. The same way I always have. She turned off the water. She stood with her wet hands over the sink and did not reach for the towel. I said terrible things to you today, she said. In front of people, you did. I've said terrible things to you before. For years, she paused. I told myself it was because I was picking up the slack, because you were never here, because I was the one dealing with everything while you were. Another gesture. Wherever you were. Doing whatever it was. I understand why you told yourself that, I said. She turned and looked at me. Her makeup had faded through the long afternoon, and without it her face looked younger and more uncertain, closer to the face I remembered from before we became the versions of ourselves that we had been for so long. Are you going to tell me I was wrong? She said. I thought about that, I think. I said carefully that you were working with incomplete information, and you drew conclusions from it that made sense given what you knew. I also think that part of you preferred not to have the complete information, because the complete information would have required you to see things differently. And seeing things differently is hard, I paused. So yes, you were wrong, but I understand how you got there. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, Craig is going to be in trouble, isn't he? It was not quite a question. It had the shape of something she had been assembling in her mind since the kitchen conversation she had not witnessed but had, in the way of people long married, partially read in her husband's face when he returned to the living room. I can't talk to you about anything related to an active review, I said. You know that. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to. She picked up the dish towel from my hands and dried her own hands slowly. I'm asking you, as my sister. Not as a lawyer. I looked at her, I said, that you should have your own attorney. Someone with no connection to Craig's firm or his clients. Someone you trust independently. She absorbed this. Okay, she said. After a long moment, okay. She handed me back the dish towel. She picked up the last plate from the rack and dried it herself and set it on the stack with the others. I'm sorry, Queenie, she said. Not dramatically. Not as a performance. Just the two words, plain and direct, which is the only form an apology actually takes when it means something. I looked at my sister, at the tired lines around her eyes, the rolled-up sleeves, the careful way she had set the plate down, and I thought about what it costs to be wrong for a long time about someone you love, and how much harder it must be to say so than to keep going. I know, I said. We finished the dishes. 3 weeks after my mother's birthday, Craig Hartwell retained outside counsel. Not someone from his firm. Someone from out of state. A defense attorney whose name I recognized from a federal case I had peripherally observed 4 years ago. The choice told me something about what Craig now understood about the shape of what was coming. You don't retain that particular kind of attorney for a minor administrative matter. You retain that attorney when you know the room you are about to walk into, and you have decided, finally, to stop pretending it isn't the room it is. I learned this not from Denise, and not from any official channel but from Hartman, who called me on a Tuesday morning while I was driving to work and said, simply, he's lawyered up. Serious counsel. Thought you'd want to know, and then asked about my mother's rosemary bush and whether it had survived the late frost that had come through the week before. It had. Of course it had. Denise called me 10 days after the birthday. I was in my apartment, a small place near the base, 2 rooms and a kitchen. The kind of apartment that looks like nobody lives there, because I have never been good at accumulating the evidence of a life in one physical location. I was eating cereal at my kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night because I had worked late and cereal required no decisions, and my phone lit up with her name and I looked at it for 1 full ring before I answered. Hi, she said. Hi, I said, a pause. Not an uncomfortable one, something more tentative, like the pause at the beginning of a conversation between people who are not yet sure what register they are speaking in. I found an attorney, she said. A woman in Richmond. She came recommended by someone from my book club whose husband had a business thing a few years ago. She has no connection to Craig's firm. That's good, I said. She explained some things to me about how these situations typically, Denise paused, about what separate counsel means, and why I should have it. I'm glad you talked to her. Another pause. Queenie, is Mom going to be okay? Financially. Whatever happens with Craig, is she going to be? The trust is structured independently, I said. It has nothing to do with Craig's assets or liability exposure. Mom is protected. The breath she let out was long and uneven, and told me more about the last 10 days of her life than anything she could have said directly. Okay, she said. Okay. Thank you. You don't need to thank me for that, I said. That was always the plan. She was quiet for a moment. When did you set it up? The trust? 11 years ago. After Dad died and I realized Mom was managing everything alone. She never told me. I asked her not to. I wasn't trying to keep secrets from you specifically. I was trying to protect the account from being factored into decisions it shouldn't have been part of. I heard Denise absorb this, the full weight of it, what it meant that I had structured an account around the possibility that knowledge of it could be used in ways that weren't in our mother's interest. I did not say this explicitly. I did not have to. I've been thinking, Denise said slowly, about how I've talked to you for years. Not just at the party, she paused. I've been going back through, in my head, and there are a lot of moments, a lot of things I said, a lot of assumptions I made out loud. Yes, I said. I don't know how to fix all of that. You don't fix all of it, I said. You just do differently, going forward. That's what fixing looks like over time. She was quiet. Is that what you tell people? In your work? Sometimes, I said. When it's true, is it true now? I looked at my cereal bowl. The cereal had gone soft. The kitchen light was making a small humming sound that it always made and that I had been meaning to have looked at for 4 months. Yes, I said. It's true now. I went home again 6 weeks after the birthday. Not for an event, just a Saturday. My mother made coffee and we sat on the back porch in the morning light, and I told her, in more detail than I had told her before, about the investigation and the suspension and the years of tracing and the review that was now active and proceeding in ways I was cautiously optimistic about. She listened without interrupting, which was how my mother listened to things that mattered, fully, without parceling out her attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. Always, I said. Did you stay quiet about all of this? The money, the work, the things with Craig? Did you stay quiet because it was the right thing to do professionally? Or did you stay quiet because you were afraid I wouldn't believe you? I looked at the rosemary bush. It was a fair question. It was the kind of question that requires you to look at something you have been keeping in your peripheral vision and bring it into direct sight. Both, I said. For a long time it was both, she nodded. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I always believed you, she said. I need you to know that, even when I didn't have the details, even when the details made no sense to me, I always knew who you were. I looked at my mother, at her silver hair and her good posture and her hands around her coffee cup, at the 74 years of her that sat in this chair, on this porch, in this house, that still held the shape of my father in certain rooms on certain mornings. And I felt something loosen in me that I had not known was held. I know, I said. I know you did. She patted my hand. Once, the same way she always had. We drank our coffee and watched the yard and did not say anything else for a while, and the rosemary held its position against the old fence, stubborn and green and entirely indifferent to the difficulty of the ground it had been asked to grow in. Some things, I thought, just need time and enough light. They find their way regardless. A year is a long time and not a long time. It is long enough for a procurement fraud review to move through its formal stages and produce findings that result in the disbarment proceedings of two attorneys, the referral of a third party for federal criminal investigation, and the quiet professional unraveling of a man who had, for 6 years, believed that the distance between himself and his choices was permanent and uncrossable. It is not long enough to undo everything those choices cost. Some things do not get undone. They get carried differently, which is not the same thing, but it is what is available. I have learned, over the course of my career and my life, to be precise about the difference between justice and resolution. Justice is a formal thing. It has procedures, findings, outcomes that can be written down and entered into record. Resolution is something else. It is the thing that happens inside you when you stop waiting for the formal thing to make you feel whole. The two can arrive together, and sometimes they do. But they are not the same, and mistaking one for the other is how people spend years waiting for a feeling that a verdict was never going to deliver. I had stopped waiting for that feeling somewhere around year 4 of carrying Case Meridian by myself in the dark. By the time the findings came through, I had already moved on to the next thing. That is how this work goes. There is always a next thing. Denise filed for divorce in the early spring. She called me the night before she filed, not to tell me what she was doing, but to tell me she was okay. That was the call, 8 minutes. Her voice steady, her saying, I'm okay. I wanted you to know I'm okay, I said. I know you are, she said. You don't have to say that. I said, I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because I've watched you for a year, and I mean it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to be better at this, at being your sister. I said, so am I. That was enough. That was actually more than enough. It was the most honest conversation we had managed in 20 years, which tells you something about what honesty costs and why people avoid it and why it is worth every cent of the price. My mother turned 75 in April. We kept it small this time. Her request, explicit and non-negotiable. Just family. Just the people who actually belonged in the room. We sat on the back porch, all three of us, with coffee and a cake my mother had made herself because she did not trust anyone else's lemon pound cake, and she was correct not to. Denise had brought flowers. Real ones from the garden she had started in the backyard of the smaller house she was renting. Nothing fancy, just what was blooming, held together with kitchen twine. My mother put them in the blue pitcher on the porch railing, and they stayed there all afternoon. We talked about ordinary things. Aunt Patrice's new dog, the documentary about migratory birds that Pearl had told my mother about, and that my mother had watched and found, as predicted, both admirable and unnecessarily dramatic. A book Denise was reading. A trip my mother was considering. Somewhere she had never been. Somewhere warm. Somewhere that had been on a list in her mind for 30 years. And that she had decided at 75 had waited long enough. We did not talk about Craig. We did not talk about the review. We did not talk about envelopes or trust accounts or any of the things that had made last April the kind of afternoon that rearranges the furniture of a family permanently. We just sat there, the three of us, in the late afternoon light, with the wisteria coming in over the railing and the rosemary holding its ground in the corner of the yard, and I thought, this is what all of it was for. Not the findings. Not the vindication. This, the ordinary, unremarkable, completely sufficient fact of being here, in this chair with these two women in this light. Commander Hartman sent me a card in January, a real card, handwritten, with a stamp. The handwriting was careful and slightly formal, the handwriting of a man from a generation that understood that how you wrote something was part of what you were saying. It said, I told some people about Sovereign. They were glad to know. Your father would have been too. Bucky kept the card. It is on the small shelf in my apartment above the kitchen table. The shelf where I keep the 3 or 4 things I have accumulated in 44 years that I would want to have with me if I had to leave quickly. My father's watch. A photograph. A citation from the Maher case that I was given and almost did not keep, and then decided to keep, because some things deserve to be acknowledged even quietly, even privately, even if no one else ever sees them. The card is there now. I want to tell you what Sovereign means, not the official version. There is no official version, not really. Call signs are not assigned with definitions attached. They emerge from moments, from something that happens in a room or a field or a courtroom, from the particular shape of one decision at one time that reveals something about a person that other people feel the need to name. Mine came from a proceeding early in my career, a case where the outcome had been decided before the arguments began, where the pressure on me to accept the predetermined outcome was significant and specific, and came from people with the authority to make my professional life very difficult. I did not accept it. I made the arguments. I made them correctly and completely, and I did not modulate them for the comfort of the people in the room who wanted them to be shorter and quieter and more convenient. A colleague told me afterward that watching me in that room was like watching someone who understood, at a cellular level, that they did not need permission to take up space. The call sign followed. I did not choose it. I have never fully been comfortable with it, but I have come to understand that the call signs that matter are never about pride. They are receipts. They are proof of what something cost. They are the name a moment gives you when you decide, under pressure, who you actually are. I am 45 years old now. I have been called a charity case and a liability and a ghost, and once, by a general who did not expect me to win, an inconvenience. I have also been called Sovereign. I know which one I am. If this story made you think of someone who needs to hear it, a daughter, a sister, A woman who has been standing at the window being quiet for too long. Send it to her. She'll know why you did, and wherever you are watching this from, whatever time it is where you are, I hope someone in your life knows exactly who you are, even if they had to open the wrong envelope to find out.